Heaven is in My Heart, Part 3, a story from Genesis to Revelation, Chapter 12, Kings and Prophets. As Samuel got older, he appointed his sons as his successors. They were not worthy, however, and the people of Israel complained to Samuel and asked him for a king. God warned them that they would regret rejecting him as king and choosing a man for their king instead. The people insisted that they were willing to suffer the consequences. So after consulting with God, Samuel appointed Saul as the first king of the Israelites. Saul was a great warrior and won many battles. Samuel was Saul's priest, counselor, and prophet. Before a battle with the Philistines, Saul, in haste and impatience, offered the sacrifice that the priest was required to offer by ritual. Because of this disobedience, God rejected Saul as a king. God directed Samuel to find Saul's successor, who was a young shepherd boy named David from the tribe of Judah. David single-handedly defeated the Philistines in battle by fighting and killing the Philistine giant Goliath. David played the harp for Saul to soothe his mind and soul. Saul gave his daughter in marriage to David. Yet when David outperformed Saul in many battles, Saul became jealous and suspicious of David. He looked for an occasion to kill him and pursued him for many years, but was unable to harm David because God protected him. David had many chances to kill Saul, but he never dared to hurt God's anointed one, even if he was his enemy. Saul killed himself during the war with the Philistines, and 3 of his sons died in battle too. David became the new king of the Israelites. Under David, the kingdom of the Israelites expanded very quickly and reached the peak of its power. David captured Jerusalem and made it the capital of Israel. He also brought back the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. David saw Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, and was overcome with desire for her. So in Uriah's absence, he committed adultery with Bathsheba. Later, when he found out that she was pregnant, he tried to cover up his sin by bringing Uriah back and getting him to sleep with his wife. Uriah refused to go home when his fellow soldiers were dying in battle. So David murdered Uriah by sending him deliberately to the front line of the battlefield and married his widow, Bathsheba. Bathsheba gave birth to Solomon. After Samuel's death, Nathan became the prophet who counseled David. Nathan admonished David for his sin, and David repented. The son that was born to Bathsheba and David, their first son, died, but Solomon is the second son, who later goes on to become the king. The book of Psalms, which is comprised of songs, praises, and prayers, is attributed to the work of King David. As a chastisement for David's sins, his son Absalom desired to overthrow David and become the king in his father's place. But Absalom died in the rebellion when he and his armies fought against David's army. David was distraught with grief on learning of his son's death, even though his son was trying to destroy him. This shows the unconditional love that David had for his son. Sometime later, Prophet Nathan anointed Solomon as the next king after David. David desired to build a temple for the Lord and the Ark of the Covenant. Yet, while God gave all the specifications of the temple to David, he was told that he would not build the temple. Solomon asked God for wisdom to rule his people instead of riches and land. So God blessed Solomon with great wisdom. His wisdom was known throughout the world, and many people traveled far to visit King Solomon, including the Queen Sheba. The biblical book Songs of Solomon is attributed to Solomon and is a collection of love poems where God and his people are represented as a man and woman in love. Solomon completed the vision of his father, David, by building the first temple in Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant resided in the temple. Solomon married several women. Some of them were not Israelites, and he was lured by his many wives into building temples for pagan gods. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam was merciless and cruel to the people, which led to the division of Israel into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. The two tribes of Benjamin and Judah were part of Judah, and all the remaining tribes were with Israel. Many Levites remained in Judah because they were priests who offered sacrifices in Jerusalem, which became the capital city of Judah. Israel created a new capital for themselves, Samaria, and built high altars and temples where they worshipped. They were the Samaritans, and the people of Judah were the Jews. There would always be great enmity between them because many of those in Samaria intermingled and married those who were not of the Jewish faith. They worshipped the false god Baal and instituted priests for Baal to offer sacrifices to Baal. Both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah ended up being unfaithful to God, and God sent many prominent prophets to admonish them so they could avoid chastisements for their unfaithfulness.